Jesus' name we pray. Amen. There is a slogan that describes the Reformed Church, and it goes like this. The Reformed Church is reformed and always reforming. And rightly understood, these words mean that the church is self-reforming and self-corrective, continually measuring itself against God's word. Of course, this need for continual reformation implies that there's always something to be reformed. One way we see this is that wherever there's true faith, there's also religion. And now, I don't take religion here to mean a system of faith or worship, because in that sense, Christianity is a religion. Rather, when we speak of religion for the sake of our time together here, we refer to it in contrast to faith. In this light, it is a mere outward pretense of spirituality without a supernatural change of heart. It is what happens when an unregenerated heart takes the Bible and seeks to use it without the regenerating help of the Holy Spirit. Precisely because it is apparently spiritual in its veneer, this phenomenon is dangerous and persistent. It is as present today in the church as it was during the Reformation or even in Jesus' own day. And it simply means that when two people can sit next to each other at church, they can look exactly the same, act exactly the same, both look as spiritual as they can be, and yet one can be saved and another not. Our passage, in fact, taken within its context, addresses this contrast between religion and true faith. When we look at our particular passage, we would agree that it speaks of this great faith of the woman, of the Canaanite woman. In fact, Christ, at the end of that passage, says so himself. "O woman, great is your faith." But when this passage is taken in its wider context, what we begin to see is the background against which that faith is set. And that background is this false pretense, this religiosity. And so, if you look at your outline today, you will see two headings for our sermon: the deadness of religion and the vitality of faith. Under those two headings, however, what we will be doing is we will be looking, by way of contrast, at religion and faith. False religion, true faith. And we will see two sets of three contrasts each under each heading. So let us just do just that. Let's look first at the deadness of religion. Here we begin by, as it were, approaching the whole subject negatively, saying, what is it that separates religion from true faith? And first we notice that religion values superiority. You might have heard non-believers accusing Christianity of being just that, superior. That sometimes we look as though we have all the answers, we know everything. We might give off this sense of condescension towards others. And in fact, those accusations have truth to them. Sin indeed takes something received by grace and claims it, claims credit for it, trying to use it to produce a sense of superiority, to either lift itself up or put others down, or both, doing one by doing the other. Jewish religious elites of Jesus' day are case in point. Let me ask you to look at how our passage begins. Verse 21, Jesus withdraws, retreats up north. He enters, being rejected, of course, by the religious Jews. He does so, and he enters Syrian Phoenicia, which Matthew identifies by its Old Testament name of Tyre and Sidon. This was the very land of Canaan. Historically, this was a place perceived by Jews as the enemy territory. Nations that lived here were always at odds with the Hebrews. They were, in fact, a source of religious defilement, as Moses himself had commanded Israel to be unlike the idolatrous people of Canaan. Israelites, however, completely missed the point of that commandment, taking it to mean that they are superior compared to those nations. All that, even though Deuteronomy 7, verse 7, specifically states the opposite. Listen to what it says. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you. For you were the fewest of all peoples, but it is because the Lord loves you. See, sin inflates us. We feel better when we can find someone inferior to us. And in fact, sometimes our theological knowledge, to take an example, might become the source of our superiority. So can our Christian heritage, our upbringing. All good things can become a source of superiority with religion. But remember, we are not alone in feeling this way. Many Israelites felt the same. They thought it was enough to belong to the covenant of God by family ties. And yet, it is not so. Paul in Romans 11, verses 17 and 18 says the following, "But if some of the branches were broken off," meaning that some of the Israelites that were sown by blood were broken off from the covenant, "and you, although a wild olive shoot," that is, he's addressing the Gentiles, "were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you." Religion appreciates and loves superiority. And yet the Bible offers an altogether different route, because faith that we see in our passage today breeds humility. A faithful heart, as it were, knows its place. It knows its status. It knows it doesn't deserve anything but judgment from God. Let us look at verse 23. It says, "He, that is Christ, did not answer her a word." That's a rejection on his part. Verse 24, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Again, looks like another rejection by Jesus of this woman. However, she wouldn't budge. She's there, and she's not moving. Of course, the third time Jesus says something that would surely push away anyone who merely wanted him for his healing power. That is, we see that response, those words in verse 26. And yet the woman is still there. Her heart is humble. She does not belong to Israel by birth. She does not have the promises of the covenant, but those things do not discourage her. She knows she doesn't deserve what she's asking for, and yet she also knows that Christ is able to give it to her. Faith is humble, friends. And this humility is unlike false humility. And I know you know it. We can spot false humility because it lacks this boldness that this woman has. Look, she's not moving, but she's not pretending to be someone she's not. She's confident not in herself, but in Christ. She's humble, but she's so boldly. There's no pretense, false humility there. But then secondly, notice that religion exudes hypocrisy, yet faith radiates honesty. Earlier in the chapter 15 of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus exposes the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and scribes. He shows how they present themselves as righteous and holy, as it were, but don't actually live that way. In fact, in Matthew 23, he openly and repeatedly calls them hypocrites. That's almost like a high point of his confrontation with these religious leaders. He says, "You hypocrites for this and that, you hypocrites for this and that." And he just keeps calling them hypocrites, 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 hypocrites. He knows, he sees through them, and he knows that their spirituality is skin deep. Underneath this saintly facade hides selfish and unbelieving heart. You know, if we think of an example in our own lives, we know, especially those who have children, how quickly our children pick up on our hypocrisy. Even if we are genuinely interested in their best good, we are genuinely trying to lead them in the ways of the Lord, but they pick it up immediately if we don't live what we preach and what we teach. They know. This is why the gospel in our lives as Christians has to actually be lived out. In those instances, our greatest consistency is to admit our inconsistency, as it were, that we are in fact sinners, that as we teach our kids to live a certain way, we ourselves are bound to fail to do so. The only inconsistency we have is to come and say, yes, this is who I am, and yet Christ has me. Christ receives me. Christ accepts me by his grace. And so forgive me for my inconsistencies. But I'm here not to pretend that as I'm teaching you, as I'm leading you in life, I'm teaching you how to live, that I myself am the master of those things. We both need God's grace. So that's a picture, as it were, of how faith is really, it's brutally honest about its state. If religious spirituality, false spirituality, is hypocritical, it tries to present itself the way it actually isn't, faith is absolutely honest about its state. Look at how this woman approaches Jesus. She cries for help, verse 22. She literally bows before him and worships him. That's verse 25, and I think ESV tones it down a little bit. But the word here literally means she worshiped him. Her final words are words of honest affirmation, verse 27. She is an outsider. She knows she is a Gentile, an enemy of God, a dog without a privilege or a place at the table. And yet she accepts, as it were, all the terms and conditions of this interaction with Jesus. She's not put off by all of that. And yet there's no false pretense with her, but there's raw honesty. Yes, this is who I am. This is how I'm coming to you. You're perfectly right, Lord. You are perfectly right. Thirdly, religion sows idolatry. Jewish religious leaders were infamously known for the emphasis and value they placed on their status in the broader society. Their place in it was their idol. In Mark 12, verses 38 and 39, we read Jesus say, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts." Beware of those. However, the thing is, you don't need to be a scribe to be an idolater. You know, we might want to be friends with a pastor, to be close to the influential, to the popular in the church. We might ignore those who are uncomfortable to us or of less value to us. And the same is even more true about the world. When we speak of religion today, as I defined it in the beginning, whatever applies to it in this religious sphere, in the context of church, so much more of it applies to the world. The world is all about status. The times of social media mean that you are who others perceive you to be. How you present yourself, how you sell yourself. It's all about influence. It's all about status. And yet, status is but a single form of idolatry. It is but an example of our idolatrous hearts. Some of us care too much about our wealth, some about power, some about relationships, some might even about our health. You name it. But this is religion. This is not faith. Religion takes good things. Those are all good things. They all have place in our lives. And yet it makes them into ultimate things. Faith, on the other hand, while not ignorant of what is appropriate, decent, beautiful, or necessary in life, always seeks Christ. If image, status, or anything else stands between it and Jesus, it means that everything else is secondary. Look again with me at the Canaanite woman. The parallel passage of this same event that describes the same event in Mark says that she found out where Jesus was staying, and she came to him, although he didn't want to be found. Was anyone annoyed by her? It seems that those around Jesus were. Matthew 15, verse 23b. Send her away, say the disciples, for she is crying out after us. And yet she didn't care about it. This is true faith in operation. She didn't care about it, or at least she didn't care about it enough to keep her from seeking Christ. And when you think about it, well, she was not only a Canaanite. That's like a red target on your head. She was also a woman. A woman was not to approach a religious leader, a rabbi in those days. So she's, as it were, staking the residue, the remainder of her dignity, of her reputation. She's putting all of that on the table. And she's risking it all to come to him, as long as she gets to get some of this grace. This is true faith in its working. And it leads us to our second part, to our second heading, that is the vitality of faith. We are switching gears, as it were. We're still contrasting the two, but now we look at it positively. What is it about faith that could not be said about religion? The emphasis now is much more on the positive. And let us stick, for our purposes, with the imagery that Jesus uses in verse 26. He says, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now, to our mind, to our Western thinking, this remark of Jesus might seem at best condescending, and at worst, well, racist, outright insulting, you name it. That's why this passage is challenging to so many. That is why we can find so many bizarre and outright silly or even stupid and insulting interpretations of this passage. But the interesting thing is that the Jews in general, and Jesus' disciples in particular, would be perfectly fine with the description he gives of this woman as a dog. That's how they viewed the people of Canaan. Jesus is seemingly vocalizing his disciples' thoughts, isn't he? He's siding with them, is he not? Is this who Christ really is? Well, the opposite is actually the case. His parable about children and dogs is a masterpiece that is anticipating, it is setting up the Canaanite woman's answer, and that will serve to teach his disciples a valuable lesson on true faith. And we are his disciples. The lesson is not for them alone only, it is also for us today. And it is a lesson on true faith, a faith that is hungry, a faith that has sight, and a faith that is acceptable to Christ. So let's go. Faith is hungry. Hunger is, of course, our body's way of letting us know that it experiences nutrient deficiency, that it lacks fuel, as it were, that it needs to keep going. The hungrier we are, the more desperate we are to find food. And one thing that we can say about this woman is that she's desperate. If you had one word to describe her, apart from her faith, of course, you could say she's desperate. One of the greatest sorrows in life is for a parent to see their child suffer. And it is even worse as a parent when there's nothing you yourself can do to alleviate that suffering. In fact, one of the commentators suggested that when she came to Jesus, that woman came to Jesus, she was not coming strictly for her daughter's sake, but she was coming for her own sake. Because as someone who was suffering demon possession, the daughter might not in those states fully understand what's happening with her, but the woman, the mother, is actually the one testifying and witnessing all of those horrors, all of that suffering that her daughter is going through. And so, if anything, the woman was coming pleading for help for herself as well as for her daughter. She was desperate. She knew that Christ was her only hope. And so, if anything can make you desperate, it is this: see your children suffer. And yet she's not giving up. She's desperate to receive his answer, a response to this problem. She knew that Christ was indeed her only hope. Isn't that an apt description of faith? It remembers daily its ongoing dependence on Christ. Jesus affirms it in John 15, verse 5, when he says that I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. We know that even the very way we come to faith is through the experience of our spiritual hunger. We see our hopelessness in sin before we find hope in Christ. And so, the image of a hungry dog waiting for any crumb or a bit to fall on the ground accurately describes true faith. A hungry dog does not complain about food. It does not pick and choose, but seeks every bit, every piece that falls into its lap, as it were. But now think how contrasting that is to the children of Israel. Just a few chapters ago, in chapter 14, Matthew describes Jesus' rejection in Nazareth. People there could not have looked past the fact that he was a carpenter's son. They were, as we're complaining about the food. They were receiving the food. They were sitting at the table. They had plates full of the bread of life. And they couldn't see through the fact that he was a carpenter's son and not someone who's coming from a palace, who has a status in society other than that. Let's take the illustration that Jesus gives us in verse 26. Let's take it further. The children at the table were not hungry because they were satiated with mere substitutes. The children in Jesus' short parable have no desire for food, for real, lasting, eternal food. In fact, in John 6, after he had fed the 5,000, this is how he responds to a crowd just like this. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Verse 26. Then later in that same passage he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you don't believe. Verse 35 and 36. Religion feeds on substitutes, but true faith is desperate for God. Secondly, faith has sight. When we look at our passage as a whole, what is the most fascinating thing about our text? I would argue that it is the response that this woman gives in verse 27. Now, what is so special about it? What makes Jesus say to her, great is your faith? It's very simple. She has sight. She sees Christ for who he is. Notice in verse 15 earlier in the chapter how he describes Jewish leaders and their followers. He says, let them alone. They are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, what will happen? Both will fall into a pit. Even to his disciples, a verse or two later, when they asked him to explain the parable about clean and unclean food, he says, "Are you also still without understanding?" So what is he talking about? What is this understanding? See, the Jews seemingly had everything. There's were the scriptures, there's where the promises, there's where was the covenant, the redemptive history was theirs. They were in the middle of it all. Jesus' disciples had all that and more. They had Christ himself in their midst. And yet they failed to see the one it all pointed to. Jesus was among them, and yet still, they at times, even his disciples failed to understand what he means and what he's about. And then we see this Gentile woman. This woman that, although she did not have the scriptures, she was not a child of the covenant. She did not have the privilege of hearing Christ preach daily. She, by a mere accident, probably heard of him and of this message that he had. This woman, against all odds, had one thing that mattered, and that one thing was faith. Faith that recognizes its object. Look at verse 22. She calls him the Son of David. Verse 27, she identifies him as the very master of the table. This is why it's absolutely clear that this woman has saving faith. She knows. She knows. Look, she says, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. She's essentially telling Jesus this: Jesus, your primary mission is for the Jews, but haven't they rejected you time and again? Isn't that the very reason you came here after all? Well, the reason why you're in enemy territory. And so Jesus, if the children won't take it, don't let any of this precious food go to waste. Please, precious Jesus, let me eat the crumbs. If the children don't appreciate it, I will. Faith recognizes its object. It has eyes to see and ears to hear. It knows its master. The question is, do we know ours? Thirdly, let us look at how Christ responds to faith and how he responds to religion. First, let's just quickly see that his response to religion is as follows. We remember his reactions to the Jewish religious leaders. He saw right through them. He knew exactly who they were. He would expose, rebuke, condemn them. Remember his reactions to false religiosity and piety in general. How he laments over Jerusalem and its rejection of him in Matthew 23, verse 37. In fact, we have seen that our text itself is a stern rebuke of this thick and stubborn form of unbelief. Moreover, the Bible repeatedly tells us that such unbelief, even if it has the pretense and the form of religion and faith, this stubborn unbelief, mere outward, proud, idolatrous religion receives nothing but condemnation. So this is how Christ responds to religion. But how does he respond to faith? Let me draw out quickly several things. Faith gets what it asks for. That's one. We notice what happens to this Canaanite woman. She, having rejected her 3 times, Jesus praises her faith and fulfills her request. He says, "Great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." Now, does this mean that our every prayer is answered immediately or eventually? I believe it's not so. We know from our experience that many times we pray, those things remain unanswered. So what am I talking about here? Well, what happens is to this woman, the reason why her prayer is answered is, biblically speaking, because she prayed in accordance with God's will, to God's will. In 1 John 5:14, it says, "And this is the confidence that we have toward him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us." And this is what faith does to us. When we first believe, God's Spirit begins conforming us to the image of Christ. Our wishes, desires, longings, needs are increasingly more in line with God's will. As a child, you know it is the best thing to learn how to trust your parents. That's the best you can do to yourself. Whatever you ask of them, you do it with confidence that they know best how and when to answer that request. So it is with true faith. It gets what it asks for because it knows better and better what to ask for. Faith is also content and trusting in the perfect will and wisdom of its heavenly Father. So when it asks for something, the content of our asking is changing. And it's shaping to be more and more in line with who God is. But we are also growing more and more in being content and trusting that God knows perfect timing, that he hears us and he knows when and how to answer our prayers, and that he is able, however we pray, he is able to discern the kernel of our prayer that is true to his will. So we might be praying for one thing with our lips, but he knows that our heart is desiring something else, and that something else is under that. That prayer is actually our lack of ability to communicate the true thing that we desire. And he gives us that true thing. And he promises to answer our prayers that are in accordance with his will. So faith gets what it asks for. Then faith grows in the process. When Jesus says, "Great is your faith," he's not simply praising this woman's own merit. What he is doing is he's pronouncing a result. Great is your faith. Remember that faith the size of a seed, a mustard seed, is still faith and is enough for us to be called God's children. But while we are saved by grace alone, faith never remains alone. Grace never remains alone. It produces fruit. It grows. James 2:24 speaks of that. Galatians 5:6 speaks of that. And that's exactly what we see God do in our text. From our perspective, Jesus is seemingly rejecting this woman and nothing more. It might be unkind, it might sound condescending, unnecessary to some. It's outright evil, what he's doing. But what is God actually doing in this passage, in this perfect wisdom, is he knows when to remain silent and when and how to respond. We see this wisdom at work here as he matures and grows this woman's faith until Christ himself declares, "O woman, great is your faith." This is God's response to true faith. He grows it. He shapes it. He faithfully develops it until one day your faith, you yourselves, will be perfect. Sin will be done away with. That's what Christ does. And thirdly, it's spread as a response. Christ responds by seeing this faith spread. What stands out in this whole pericope is that in enemy territory, Jesus is not performing divine judgment, but praising and acknowledging faith. Remember our reading earlier this morning from Deuteronomy? That's where the ban is proclaimed over these Canaanite nations. They were to be set apart for utter destruction. They were an utter abomination to God. And yet we have Christ here leaving Israel, going into a foreign land, into enemy territory, and instead of performing divine judgment over these people, he finds and affirms and celebrates true and living faith. We know that in the Old Testament, when a Gentile wanted to join Israel, to become part of the covenant, they had to fully submit themselves to the whole system of Jewish law. In a very real sense, they had to become Jewish. Moreover, the Canaanite nations in the Old Testament, they, as we've seen, they were set for destruction, and yet we find neither of those things here. Instead, here comes a woman whose faith exceeds and puts to shame many Jewish believers. And the surprising thing, of course, is that Christ accepts her, and she's not destroyed. So what is this telling us? Surely Pentecost has not yet happened, and the time of the Gentiles has not yet come. But here's a foretaste of what God's kingdom is about to be, of what the things that are to come will be like. This is a peek into the reality of God's world where his enemies would become his friends. His adversaries will become his children. Years later, Jewish believers would marvel and glorify God for this saying. As we read in Acts 11, they say, "Then to the Gentiles also God has granted repentance that leads to life." So you see, faith spreads. This is a foretaste of what is to come. Christ himself came to bring salvation and condemnation to the nation of the Jews. This woman understands it, and yet she knows that there is place for Gentiles, for the Gentiles, for his enemies, for the dogs in his house as well. That is the greatness of her faith. She understands it. She understands that God's kingdom is not bound by nationality. She understands that God's kingdom is not bound by your upbringing, that God's kingdom is not bound by who others perceive you to be. God's kingdom is bound by how he perceives you, whether a believer or a non-believer. But the question behind this is, how do we become that? What is it that happens that the enemies of God can be called his friends? How can Gentiles like you and me, and we are those Gentiles, we're not Israelites, we are Gentiles here today, how is it that we can become God's friends? How can the dogs eat the crumbs from the Father's table? The answer, of course, is Jesus. He receives the judgment due to God's enemies, and we sinners, God's adversaries, we receive the privilege of being called the children of God. And the wonderful thing is to extend the imagery, to use the imagery of Christ's parable. Not only are we the dogs there eating the crumbs, but we are given the privilege to actually sit at the table, to be part of God's banquet, to be called his children. And so, as we see this truth before us, the question is, how should we live with it? What should we make of it? And I would say that this faith of this Canaanite woman, for starters, it really challenges us for several reasons. It ought to challenge us as it did Jesus' disciples. Here are people who have everything they need, as it were, to believe Christ. And this woman poses a question before them. She poses a question before us today. That question is, do we find the zeal and persistence in our faith? Do we feel desperate for Christ? Not only in salvation, in that first initial moment of our life with him, but in daily sustenance. Do we see the supremacy of Christ in our lives? Or are we comfortable as long as we are called his disciples? As long as we come to church? As long as we know our Bibles? As long as we sit under the teaching during the Sunday class? As long as we hear preaching? As long as we walk away and say, wow, that was sound preaching, that was so good. Oh, sound preaching does nothing unless it's lived out, unless it's accepted, unless it's received, unless it goes through you, unless the Word of God goes through you, shapes you and molds you and challenges you. The only fact that you've heard someone preach well or someone preach the Bible means nothing otherwise. How we answer all these questions describes the condition our faith is in. This woman is also posing a challenge to us because she knew nothing. She had nothing. And out of that, the little that she had, by God's grace, great faith flourished. We have a lot. Even if you didn't have this building, these people right here, this service right now, and the only thing you had was this book, it's a million times more than she would ever have. So she poses a real challenge to us. This passage calls us to contrast us to her and see, well, where do we stand? And not to put us down in a way that, well, I'm an unbeliever, I'm beyond hope. No, precisely the opposite is true. To see where we are, to see that we need Christ. This challenges us to go to him, to go at his feet and pray and ask not only for his forgiveness, for our blindness in the face of all this evidence, but also for his grace and steadfast love to grow us and to lead us into the fullness of this truth. But then her faith ought to challenge us as it did the religious leaders. The question is very real. Having been shown grace, do we serve as vessels of God's grace to others, or do we privatize grace? Do we use our faith to feel smug and superior to our other brothers and sisters or to unbelievers? Is the church a community of the living God that testifies to his mercy and grace shown to it? Or is it a place where we build our social clubs, our circles of people, of friends that have quotas and limits as to how many people can be accepted? Do I see the world only as a threat to my faith or as a mission field in which I'm fulfilling the great commission that Christ himself has given to me? In other words, again, am I a vessel of God's grace, or am I keeping it to myself? Now you might be thinking, so where's he placing us? Is this some, does he have like a hidden agenda trying to hint at something? I am not. And the reality is this: by faith, like if you believe Christ, you belong under the category of faith, and that's unquestionable. But the reality is this, and the Bible testifies to it, that while we are saved by grace and we are in Christ, we are still battling and struggling with sin. And that sin explains how true born-again Christians can still be sinful, idolatrous, condescending, insensitive, unloving. How they still can make this living, breathing body of Christ, this church, into their high castle from which they look down at the world. And that's what we have to affirm. That's what we have to acknowledge. That's what our passage calls us to affirm and acknowledge, that there's that duality. But there's ultimately hope in Christ. And while he calls us to acknowledge that, here's whichever way we answer all those questions that I laid out before you, let us remember this. On the one hand, even those closest to Jesus, that is his disciples, needed this challenge. They needed to hear this. So if you feel like this is what you need to hear, don't be discouraged by it. It's good that you need to hear it. On the other hand, look at this very woman. Even God's greatest enemies can receive faith and be strengthened in it. So be comforted.